We're very pleased to welcome Paula Moore. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate it. I'm curious, Paula, what are the key elements that you were looking for when you were doing A&R research for the record labels? Because that's distinct from A&R work. It's a different field. So could you talk about that?
Yeah, I think that, A&R research is more predominant in the field now, and I think it's crossed over to not be such a specialty, but to be a requirement of A&R these days. When I was doing it, it was kind of like new and uncharted territory, and people didn't really know what to make of the information that we were gathering, which we now at my company call intelligence gathering. And that process helped us kind of determine what artists might be on the right trajectory to, to success, to reach a larger audience, to warrant a viable, sustainable career signed to a major label. I mean, there's a big investment made for artists when they're signed to a major label. And, the days of being an A&R guy and jumping up and down on your boss's desk saying, I just think this is it, we're kind of over.
Right.
You needed more to convince the single decision maker at a major label to say, yes, let's put $1 million towards that artist,
What were those specific factors that you were then looking for? What elements made up intelligence?
Well, I think key indicators in an A&R research capacity looking for an emerging artist that's viable for signing consideration at a major label, indicators would be, that there's a clear and obvious path that they're on to gain or sustain a larger audience.
Okay.
It could be that they are playing locally and over the course of 6 months gained momentum as far as fan base and are now headlining a 500 person, capacity venue. That's a indicator to us, on an A&R research standpoint that something's happening with that band. Today in social media, there are a lot of indicators that weren't available to me when I was working at Warner Brothers or Universal. We didn't have Twitter feeds, and I didn't have MySpace. I didn't have, we didn't have Facebook. I didn't have any of those resources. So I had to rely on radio and still local radio, whether it's community-based radio or, part of, one of the Clear Channel radio stations. They still are supporting local music and regional music. And you can still identify that there's, a viable artist locally or regionally based on their airplay. I think that's still a factor. Sales, not so much. New artists, kids aren't really selling CDs out of their trunks as much as they used to back in the day.
Okay, yeah.
So it's all like watching digital trends now versus how many records have they sold, how many local, record stores are featuring this artist, which doesn't exist anymore. So it's very different.
Okay.
And we had to adapt and change our processes and our methodology for A&R research, so much over the past couple of years. Just in the last year, our methodology has evolved tremendously because we have to monitor different indicators.
Okay. Different things that make up a success or make up the potential trajectory of somebody.
Right.
Okay.
And that's social media or tracking, any sort of digital assets that they may have, learning more about what's going on with them with their story online, how many kids are following them, how many kids are actually engaged as their fans, not just passively, but actively engaged. Do they have super fans? Are those indicators there?
Okay. What things do you look for to get that? Do you look at their site? Do you look at the amount of plays that they get on their videos? Do you look at their Facebook accounts, their Twitter? What are you looking at to
All
determine?
of that.
All of that. Okay.
All of it.
All
of
right.
it. And more.
Okay.
We monitor more than 25 different intelligence indicators for emerging music, and specifically narrowing it down, by a genre. We do different things for urban music as far as research goes than we do for rock or.
Oh, can you talk about that?
Artists.
That's interesting. So there's distinctions in the genres in terms of what you'll do and what you won't do, depending on the style of music.
Yeah, I think depending on the style of music and really depending on the culture, it's really about, in the urban music community, it's not so much about playing live shows night after night after night when you're an emerging urban artist. It's about, who you're connected to, what other artists that you know that are in that community that are also kind of buzzing and happening. It's not about how many live shows you're doing like a rock artist would do.
Okay.
They don't play at the Roxy every night, but there are these parties and cultural phenomenons that go on in the urban music culture that we learn about through, a lot of it is through word of mouth or through social media activity or support from fans that are talking about things that they did that are kind of off the grid. So I think the nuances are just a little different on what we track and why.
You seem to have so many more elements today. I mean, back in the day when you only had, radio, or you had, newspapers or local stations, like we were saying, those were your, established parameters. But now, I mean, you're saying 25 different metrics that you're using in your work to
at minimum.
Minimum, okay.
Yeah.
To look at this.
I mean, back in the day, like when I was at Warner Brothers, I was one of 5 women in A&R that had vice president title.
Right.
And my objective for that particular job was to develop a scouting community that could identify what Warner's was going to sign or what might be signed globally, through the group. And an example was when one of my scouts, Braden Merrick, found the Killers. Found it, through a resource locally in Las Vegas, through Airplay, and through the rehearsal facility that they were rehearsing at.
Really? Right down to the rehearsal facility. Okay.
And today, I mean, he didn't have those resources, to look online or find them through Facebook or find any other indicators. It was really just, I think, as simple as it sounds, somebody told him and he followed up on it and boom.
And they went ahead and did it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that was a very,
and
very
most
big
of our
success.
scouts, I mean, that's how most of our scouts, became successful. That Warner system was probably the most successful scouting system in the history of the music industry.
Yes.
We had the most signings. We had many of those scouts still hold A&R jobs today. I mean, we really got our system down, I think, there. And that's where, the Killers, and that's where I started developing Santi Gold and, all the things that came out of that system that was, huge for my career at the time.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
And you've parlayed that into your own company.
Yeah.
Continuing this kind of work with the kinds of tools that you now, have. I mean, you said 25 at least.
Yeah.
That's significant.
Yeah, it is. Because I don't just work with music companies anymore.
Who else do you work with?
We work with brands. I work with a lot of corporations that want to align with emerging trends, emerging culture, and emerging music, and just be a part of something that is growing or cultivating in the space, specifically in the landscape around, university, college age lifestyle.
Okay.
So we do a lot of work with brands and help them kind of navigate where they're spending their money, a greater return on investment, a greater return on their objectives, and making sure that what they're trying to align their product with is really as successful as it can be.